I don't think so. We're going to have an early chakras meeting, but I think we should be back by then. Okay. So we have been talking for months and months about this question of who is a Jew, and we've had so many different perspectives. So today, we're finally going to settle down and look at this question through the makoros of halacha. That's going to be the perspective today. And what's interesting is that the person who is bringing us this perspective is a Baal Halacha, is a posek, and the perspective that he's bringing us is very traditional, even though this person, if you look at the great rabbinic luminaries over the 20th century, would be probably one of the most non-traditional, the most maverick, unusual halachic decisors of the 20th century. And his name was Rav Shlomo Goren. Rav Shlomo Goren was a remarkable, inspirational, unique, controversial, and highly innovative rabbinic personality. There is another controversial and interesting rabbinic personality. His name is Rav Shagar, Zichrono Livracha. Rav Shagar, the postmodernist Zionist thinker. Rav Shagar wrote an essay comparing the halachic approaches of Rav Moshe Tzvi Neria, from Kfar HaRoeh, the founder of the Bnei Akiva movement, great religious Zionist leader, and Rav Shlomo Goren, the late chief rabbi. And he noted how Rav Goren's approach to halacha and halachic learning and the implementation of halacha was radically different than Rav Neria, and that Rav Neria represented the continuity of a more traditional rabbinic approach to the understanding and the application of halacha, whereas Rav Goren was, in certain respects, an iconoclast, a maverick in his application of halacha. He was born in 1917 in the family of Gera Hasidim, who moved to Kfar Hasidim in Israel in 1925, which was a religious settlement. And he was sent to Yerushalayim to study in the Chevron Yeshiva. We've spoken about Chevron before. It's a place that was attracting some of the most outstanding younger rabbinic personalities of the generation. It was, remember, that was the continuation of the Slobodka Yeshiva. We talked about that a lot when we spoke about Reb Chatzkel Sarna. He received smicha at the age of 17, and then he actually studied philosophy, mathematics in Hebrew University from 1940 until 1944. In addition to being a young rabbinic genius, his first publication was, I think he was at the age of 17, was on Chidushim of the Rambam. But then also in 1936, he joined the Haganah. He wrote, in addition, he wrote a work at the age of 21 on the laws of mikvah called Sha'arei Tara, and he fought in the Haganah Milchemet HaShechur in 1948. So he's a man of many different dimensions, and he was appointed as a brigadier general of the IDF. He was first appointed as a chaplain, then rising to the rank of brigadier general. And he himself trained and became an active soldier. He then became a general. He became the chief rabbi of the army. And he transformed the Israeli army experience using his halachic brilliance. And because he was known as a genius, as a young man. So he institutionalized many halachic principles in this new army and using his role. So whether it was establishing kashrus principles in the army or the observances of Yom Tov, he wrote several volumes of tshuvas. I have them at home. They're called, I think they're called Meshiv Molchama. I forget now. 3 volumes of tshuvas, of responsa, in dealing with practical army issues in light of halacha. how to integrate traditional halacha into a modern society, and specifically into the modern army. He was, in 1968, he was elected chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, Yafo, and in 1973, he served as the chief rabbi of Israel until 1983. At the same time, this young genius who was involved in the army was also, I would say, somewhat of a maverick in his personal life. So, for example, he married the daughter of the Nazir, Rav David Cohen, and became a vegetarian. Okay, not the most unusual thing, but he also created a unified nusach for the army, because he says we can't have everybody, this one davening nusach Sfar, this one davening nusach Ashkenaz. So it was controversial. He adjusted the prayer of Nachim after 1967, because he said, in his view, Yerushalayim is not destroyed in the way that it's being described in the prayer. He had a very famous controversial case, which we're not going to get into today, that reflected his forcefulness and his initiative in halachic areas. It was called the Langer case, and it marked a substantial break between him and the rest of the majority of the Torah community, in which he ruled, and there was a secret Beis Din, which it's a lot of stuff going on here about which I'm not qualified to speak, and some of it probably constitutes Lashon Hara. So even if I were qualified to speak, I probably should not speak. But to understand that Rav Goren allowed two people, these two children of what seemed to be an illicit marriage, which would create the status of mamzerus for these children, to allow them to marry according to Israeli law, which was a big controversy at the time. It caused a tremendous rift in the Torah community. This is what led the late Rav Shlomo Yosef Elyashiv, the Gaon, one of the greatest Torah generation leaders of the Torah generation, previous door, to leave the Rabbanut out of protest of Rav Goren, and it caused many other tragic ripple effects, including the way that people viewed Rav Goren, his other Piskei Halacha. It was a terrible, tremendous controversy. So Rav Goren was a complicated person, and he was an innovator. And at the same time, he saw himself as a staunch defender of halacha and the application of halacha in a complicated modern context. Part of what likely was driving him to find whatever heter he could in the Langer case was the push from the other side of the political spectrum, that if the rabbinic authorities weren't going to figure out something for this couple, these two couples, then they were going to institute civil marriage in Israel, which he thought was a terrible abrogation of halacha. So there was this push-pull in which he was innovating, but still feeling the sense of fealty. So for all of Rav Goren's great innovations and controversial Piskei Halacha, his letter to Ben Gurion represents arguably the most traditional, conservative, standard approach to a halachic issue that you will find. And that's what I'd like to share with you. That interestingly, of all the letters of the people that wrote to Ben Gurion, everybody says it's known, it's well known who is a Jew and who is not a Jew. So Rav Goren says, well, let's look at the sources. Let's go to the book. So he writes Ben Gurion, and that's why we're not going to go through the whole letter. He writes Ben Gurion, God bless him, 1, 2, 3, like 8 pages, a whole shir kloli on who is a Jew. The second half is, okay, now that we know who is not a Jew, what are the laws of conversion? So you have Mila, you have Tevila, you have Kabbalah Sol Mitzvahs. So he goes through all the Marmakomos, all the details of conversion. We're not going to do that today. That's a whole nother shir. But what I'd like to share with you is I just pulled the Marmakomos from Rav Goren's letter, and I put them on the sheets here. For those who are online, let's see if we can pull them up for you. Don't say I never did anything nice for the people on Zoom, all right? Let's not. Here we go. No. Oh, no, this is not it. Let's see if I can find it. So we're just going to go through a regal achas, not all the things, but almost all the Marmakomos that Rav Goren gives us here. All right, you'll tell me, all the folks who are online, you'll tell me if you can see. Can you see? Can you see the Marmakomos? Yes. Okay, great. So Rav Goren says, let's start with the Mishnayos. Let's start with Torah Shebal Peh, and then we're going to move to Torah Shebichsav. The Mishnah says in Kiddushin, source number 1, V'chol mi she'ein lo lo olav v'lo ala chayrim Kiddushin. Any person, any man who does not have, or any woman in this case, not have on him or on others Kiddushin, Havlad, the offspring, Kemosa, follows her. When you have a union that two people create a child, but those two people are not subject to the covenant of Kiddushin. What is Kiddushin? Right, there are 2 steps actually in a Jewish marriage. There is Kiddushin or Erisin and Nisuin. It is the halachic creation of a marriage. And that bond, we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, Andre Neher, we spoke about the Napoleonic Sanhedrin. One of the issues that the Napoleonic Sanhedrin dealt with was intermarriage. Napoleon was interested in figuring out, can Jews marry Stam French people? All right, how are you going to answer that to Napoleon? So the answer is, I'm not going to tell you whether Jews can marry, can't, but whatever. That's not the issue. Here's the story. They said to Napoleon, look, France is the eldest daughter of the church. How would the church feel about creating a religious union between members of its own faith and people who don't have the same set of assumptions? How can you create a religious institution with one party that doesn't subscribe to the principles of that religion? So what they said was, they said to Napoleon, look, the Catholic Church isn't interested in doing that. We have something called Kiddushin. Kiddushin is a formal religious construct. You can't create a construct if not both parties are buying into that construct. So it's not really a question of can Jews marry non-Jews. There's no such thing as Kiddushin for 2 people who don't have the same set of assumptions. So therefore, when you have a mixed marriage where you have one party and another party who are not from the same faith community, that's not Kiddushin. That's not a halachic union. So what do you do in that case where there's not olav v'lo alachem Kiddushin? That person, the non-Jewish person, whether it's the husband or the wife, there is no Kiddushin. So the Mishnah says, Havlad kemosa. The offspring follows the woman. Ve'eza zeh, what is that? What are we talking about? Zeh Vlad, this is the offspring. Shifcha v'nachris. You see it on the screen? Everybody, can you see here? Source number 1. Shifcha v'nachris, of a non-Jewish maidservant or a non-Jewish woman. So Rashi explains right here on the page. Says Rashi, Havlad kemosa, source number 2, Vlad nachris, the offspring of a non-Jewish woman, even if they had whatever ceremonial process, whatever Sheva Brachas, whatever party, whatever ring, doesn't matter. Vlad Nachris, Nachri. The offspring of a Nachris, of a non-Jewish woman, is a non-Jew, is a Gentile. V'im Giruhu, if they converted the child, which is the later part of Rav Goren's letter, have a ger kosher ve'eno mamzer. That person is a kosher ger. They're not a mamzer. Mamzer means somebody who was born of an illicit union from which there could have been kiddushin. 2 Jewish people who are forbidden to each other. The creation there is a mamzer, but here the creation is a ger. Nothing wrong. Similarly, Rav Goren says, Rav Goren has tremendous bekias because he's a genius mind. If you ever learn any of Rav Goren's svarim, Torah Samoadim or his chuvas, he quotes from, he just marshals sources from everywhere. Well, I'll just interject with one more little maisa. My Rebbe from Yoredea, from Grus, my Rebbe, Rav David Miller, so he's the head of the Grus Kolel. Rav Miller is the head of the Ritz Kolel in Yerushalayim. So when we were in Grus, that's where I learned Yoredea. So Macham and I were first married, we lived in Grus. Rav Miller was giving Yoredea shiurim for my smicha. So he told us that when he came to Israel, he made aliyah, but he only had smicha from Reis. He didn't have smicha from the Rabbanut. So apparently at that time, when he came out aliyah, he had a bechina. It must have been, in this period. I think it was in the late 70s. He had a bechina with Rav Goren to just confirm that he knew something. So Rav Goren said, "Oh, you have smicha. So why don't we review the Talmud Yerushalmi on Chulin?" And Rav Miller was like, "Who learns the Talmud Yerushalmi on Chulin? Like, I just learned Yoredea." He said to Rav Goren, he's like, I didn't learn the Talmud Yerushalmi. Rav Goren was like, "Okay, so let's learn the sugya of Kchal, which is, I think, Simon Tzadi in Yoredea." I can tell you, I learned this in Yoredea, and Rav Miller learned this in Yoredea. Most people have no idea what's going on in Kchal. I certainly don't. Kchal is an udder. And so there are unbelievably complicated halachos about the kashrus of an udder, because the meat part is meat and the milk part is dairy. And how do you create a kosher udder, and how do you cut it? And what are the permutations of this? And Rav Goren was like, "Yeah, let's just talk about Kchal." Like, can you imagine somebody walks into your office one day and it's like, "Yeah, let's talk about the most intricate Yoredea topic you could ever possibly imagine." That's where Rav Goren was. So he's going to marshal in this letter. He's just going to marshal sources, just one after the next, after the next. He just lines them up from Ben Gurion, like, here are your marmakomos. Says the Gemara. The Gemara. Let's finish this Gemara. This is the Gemara. This is in Kidusian. This is the context. If you see on source number 3, the Gemara says, "Vlada kamosa minolan." How do you know that the vlad, the offspring, follows the mother? To Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "Ha'isha v'yiladea," the woman and her children. In the case of a non-Jewish and shifcha kananis, tiyel adoneh, should belong to the master. So that's true. You see, the children follow the mother. Nachris minolan. How do you know about a non-Jewish woman? Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "Lo sischatin bam." You should not marry them. Now, this line, "Lo sischatin bam," has a lot more to unpack. We're not going to do it today. The prohibition against intermarriage is complicated. This pasuk is said specifically in the context of the Shiva Amim in the 7 Canaanite nations, but the Gemara is using it more generally here. So the Gemara says, yeah, ashkachna, second line, ashkachna, I see de lo tafsiba Kidusian, I understand that you're not allowed to marry them, and that the implication of the Gemara is that there is no marriage contract between you. But how do you know that the child follows the mother? So Reb Yochanan, Rishon Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, says the Heliga Reb Yochanan in the name of the Heliga Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. Damar Kra, the pasuk says, "Ki yasir es bincha me'acharai." If your daughter goes to marry some non-Jew, some Gentile, he will cause that child to stray from me. Bincha haba miYisrael, says the Gemara, your son who comes from a Jewish woman, koroi bincha, is called your son. Ve'ein bincha haba min ha'ovedes kochavim, koroi bincha ela b'na. But the child that comes from a woman who is ovedes kochavim, then it's called her child, not your child. So this is the first sugya, the Gemara in Kiddushin. Says Rav Goren, take a look here in source number 4. Here's also a Gemara in Yevamos, Daf Chaf Beis. Mi sheyesh lo ben mikol makom. There is a din that if a man, Rachmana litzlan, is married and his wife has no children and he passes away, that the wife, that's right, the wife, but what if the man has a child? So then there's no yibum. So what if the man has a child and the child is from a non-Jewish woman? So the Gemara says, "Yish lo ben b'kol makom poter eishes aviv min hayibum." A man who has a son from any place paters his father's wife from yibum. V'chayav al malkasav v'kil laso. And God forbid a child who hits or curses their parent would be chayav misa. That child follows the parent. Ubeno l'chol davar, and is their child for everything chutz, except mimish yesh lo ben, somebody who has a son, min hashivcha, from a non-Jewish maidservant, umino vedes kochavim, or from a non-Jewish woman. So Rav Goren says we have a beferish Gemara. Ben Gurion, you have a shaila. What to do with the children of mixed marriages? He says it's 2 beferish Gemaras. Well, the Gemara never tells you in the end of the book. It never says like, okay, so this is the summary of the laws. There's a lot of conversation. Sometimes it says Hilchasa like this, but how do you know how to codify what it says in the Gemara? So therefore, the Rambam came along and says, I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to codify for you all the laws according to their topic. Because the Rambam says the Gemara is an amazing journey in learning, but it's very complicated. The Rambam also was a taxonomist. The Rambam was a very systematic thinker in a certain similar way to like the Greek organized mathematical perspective. He was a scientist, he was a physician. So he says, I'm going to organize it for you in a more systematic way. Terrific. The Rambam says, let me organize it for you. And I'll tell you in two places. The first one is on your page in source number 5, the Rambam in Hilchos Isurei Bia, laws of relationships. Zeh klal, this is the rule. Herzi, focus. This is the rule. Ben haba min ha'eved, o min ha'akum, o min ha'shivcha, o min basakum. A child that comes from a non-Jewish father, whether it's non-Jewish because the father is a Gentile or he's a non-Jewish servant, or the mother is non-Jewish or she's a female servant. Hare hu ki'imo. It follows the mother. Ve'ein mashgichin al ha'av. You do not look at the father. Period. Period. The Rambam then goes on to explain how you can use this to help in a case where there is a mamzer, to find a way for that mamzer to ultimately get back into the Jewish people based on specific rules about mamzerim and gerim. But this is an unequivocal psak of the Rambam, and similar in number 6, same Rambam, same font, different halacha. This is in Yibam V'Chalitza. Avol beno min hashivcha min hanachris eino poter shezera haba min hashivcha avodim v'haba min hagoyim v'hagoya goyim uki'ilu einam. So it says Rav Goren, it's a Beferisha Rambam that the child of a non-Jewish woman is not Jewish. Then Rav Goren says, let's look at the root of this idea in Tanakh, in Torah Shebechsav. He says, I'll tell you a story. The story appears in the Sefer, the book of Ezra, Perek Yud, Pasuk Beis. You know, Ezra came back on the Aliyah from Bavel, and it was not so simple. Unfortunately, there were only, I think about 40, I forget the exact number, 43,000 and change people who came back on the Aliyah. They had the opportunity to come back and build the second base in Mikdash, but most people stayed home. Stayed home in Bavel. They didn't come. And even the people that came, it wasn't exactly, the it wasn't the distinguished chevra who are here learning Sunday morning, learning Torah, committed, inspired, amazing, right? Not exactly. Ezra looks around at these people and he says to them, Vayan Shchanya ben Yechim ibn Elam. Vayomer Ezra, they say to Ezra, the people say, look, Rebbe, we have to tell you the truth. Anachnu ma'alnu velokeinu. We betrayed our God. Vanoshev noshim nochrios me'ameh haaretz. And we married non-Jewish women. Va'ata yesh mikveh Yisrael al zos. Is there any hope? Is there any purification? Is there any future? You know what says the pasuk in Gimel? Let's do this. Va'ata nichras bris lelokeinu. Let's build a covenant. Let's come back to the Rebbe Shalom. He's waiting for us. He wants us to be with him. So you know what we're going to do? Lohotzi. We're going to take out kol nashim. All of these non-Jewish wives. We're going to end the intermarriage. So it's just parenthetically important to note that there's no such thing in Chodesh Tachas HaShamesh. There's no such thing as a new problem. The problems of intermarriage, they're as old as the Tanakh. The problems of focusing during davening and being, all these problems. So we're just trying to misake. But what does it say? Lohotzi kol nashim, to remove all the women. And then what does it say next? What does it say after Lohotzi kol nashim in Pasuk Gimel? That's right. V'hanolad mehem, and those born to them, their offspring. So why are they telling them to separate out the offspring of the non-Jewish women? That's it. That's it. Because they're not Jewish. Says Rav Goren, that's what it says in the pasuk. Beferish. So what happened? The end of that chapter, it's interesting, for posterity in the Tanakh, every name of the family who was intermarried is pointed out name by name for the rest of this parak until the end. Kol eile nasu nashim nachrios. All these people were intermarried. V'yesh mehem nashim vayasimu banim. And they have women and children. What does it mean, v'yesh mehem banim? So look at Rashi in source number 8. Since they had nashim and the women were not Jewish, they took out the women and the children because the children were not theirs. And then Rav Goren pulls out a Talmud Yerushalmi. We mentioned how Rav Goren was an expert in Yerushalmi. Let's see if I can scroll up so you could see this on the screen. Here you go. Source number 9. The story, this is a story between Ish Yaakov, this man of Kfar Guvraya, and Atun she'elon le ma'u lemigzar bra da armiyasa b'Shabbos. What about circumcising a child, the armiyasa of a non-Jewish woman on Shabbos? Can you do a bris for a non-Jewish child on Shabbos? And the Gemara in that Yerushalmi goes on to say how they said that's crazy. Absolutely not. And it quotes this pasuk in Ezra. Why not? Because to do a bris on a non-Jewish child, that's a mila l'shem gerus for conversion. That's right. You don't do it on Shabbos. You only do a bris mila on Shabbos for a Jewish child. So the Yerushalmi says, what are you talking about? Of course not. Rav Goren brings one more interesting raya. Well, two more interesting rayas from Tanakh. Look at this one. This is very interesting. It's a pasuk in Shmuel. You see here on source number 10. Va'ani ana olech es cherpasi. Where will I take my shame? Va'ata tiye ka'achar ha'nevolim. And you will be like one of the shamed, one of the dregs of society. Va'ata daber na el hamelech. Speak to the king. Ki lo yimna'eni mimeka. He will not withhold me from you. When kids are in day school, at least years ago, they used to have a game in class. They would say, "Mi amar el mi." Who said to whom? Oh, you remember this? Mi amar el mi, right? So I want to play that game right here. Mi amar el mi. Who said this thing to whom? Someone, in this case it's a woman, is saying to a man, "Don't do this to me right now. Do not do this, because you will be a vagabond. You will be like a novel, and where will I take my shame? Speak to the king, and he will not refuse us from marrying. He will let you have me." Mi amar el mi. Anybody online? Anybody can guess? Mi amar el mi. Who said this to whom? Who said this to whom? Someone's got to unmute and see if you can figure this out. Who said this to whom? Yes! Mi amar el mi. Yes! Awesome. Tamar. That's right. Tamar. Tremendous bekias. Oh, who is Tamar, the daughter of, what was the king? Of David. Tamar, the daughter of David, who was being coerced from Amnon. Right? The second Tamar. Right. So Amnon is trying to take advantage of this woman. And she says, "Don't do this. Don't do this. I'm going to be, my life will be destroyed if you take advantage of me. And what's going to happen to you?" Right? We know what happened to him. But then she says, don't violate me. Ask the king and we can marry. So can I ask you a question? How could she propose to Amnon, who is her brother, that they could marry? What's she trying to say? Lo yimna'eni mimeka. Speak to the king, he will not refuse me from coming to you. What is she talking about? What does that mean? Says Rashi, based on the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Shemu, source 11, Shemu teres ani lacha. I'm allowed to marry you. We're siblings. Lefishinis abra bi'imi kshihi nachris. Because my mother was not Jewish when King David was with her, because she was a Yefas Toar Shalakha David b'Milchama. She was a woman in this category of Eishes Yefas Toar, so she was not Jewish. So there's no, that's right, there's no legal relationship between us. And therefore they can marry. So Rav Goren says, it's a story in Tanakh. And one more makar he quotes from the Tanakh in Sefer Malachi. In the book of Malachi, Perek Beis, Bogda Yehuda v'toeva nesa b'Yisrael b'Yerushalayim. Something horrible, a treacherous act of begida was committed. Ki chilel Yehuda kodesh Hashem asher ohev. Yehuda was machalel the kodesh of Hashem. Uboal bas el nechar. The Yehuda, the Jewish people, we boal bas el nechar. We consorted with the daughter of a foreign god. We intermarried. And just parenthetically, whatever the technical legal prohibition of intermarriage is, which we could figure out, where do you find the pasuk? Is it los eschatin bam? Is it somewhere else? But the Torah considers that a begida, a breach of a covenant. It's not about tell me, where's it saying Shulchan Aruch you're not allowed to be intermarried? It's because your choice is choosing, you're opting out of a Jewish future, of a connection with the Ribono Shel Olam. It's so painful. So what does the next pasuk say? Yachreis Hashem la'ish asher yasena. God cuts off for the person, the man who does this. The man who does this, Er va'ona me'ol Yaakov. What is Er va'ona? Says the Ibn Ezra, source 13, Ben v'neched, a child and a grandchild. So Rav Goren says, look at all these sources. Look at the Torah Shebal Peh, look at the Torah Shebechsav. David, the Heilige Ben Gurion, I have to give you a shtickle shir, this is it. So then Rav Goren says, we have to make sure that we cover all the marmakomos, because sometimes in halacha you'll find strange shitos, unusual shitos. So one of them he quotes is the Knesset Hagdola. It's Rab Chaim Ben Aviste's commentary on the tour, on the Arba Turim of Yaakov and Asher. So he has a suggestion, Rab Chaim Ben Aviste, who says, maybe if you have a child from a mixed marriage where the mother is not Jewish, and then the child converts, when the child converts, he then is connected to his father. That's the chiddush of the Knesset Hagdola. I looked at the Knesset Hagdola. He doesn't explain it very carefully. It's in Choshen Mishpat and Siman Zayin. It's not so clear, but that's what the Knesset Hagdola says. So first of all, Rab Goren says, even according to that Knesset Hagdola, the child is not Jewish till they convert. That's Aleph. In Beis, he says all the Achronim reject that Knesset Hagdola. That's number one. He says number two, there is an interesting source in the Ramah. Rav Moshe Isolis from Krakow, the great rabbinic authority in Ashkenaz in the 17th century. The Ramah has an interesting comment. And this comment of the Ramah has bearing on our discussion. Because we said at the beginning, two major sugyas, Kidusian and Yevamos, marriage and Yibum, were relevant to this issue of figuring out whether children of non-Jewish mothers are Jewish. We said, first was, are they Jewish? And second was, for purposes of Yibum, that child, if let's say the father had a child, then the mother, whose husband just passed away, would not have to do Yibum. So we said, well, the father's child from a non-Jewish woman doesn't count. But look at this Ramah. The Shulchan Aruch says, this is in source 14, the last page in the Marmakomos. I'll read it out to you. So now the Shulchan Aruch in Hilchos Even Ezer and Hilchos Ishus is talking about a related topic about siblings, that my sister is prohibited to me in Torah, whether that sister is because we share a father or we share a mother, whether that sister is my sister, whether or not the parents' relationship was from marriage or from an extramarital relationship, even if it's from an incestuous relationship, a sister is a sister. Except for what kind of sister? A person whose father was living with two women. One was Jewish, the other one was not Jewish. And the father has a son from the Jewish mother and a daughter from the non-Jewish woman. Says the Shulchan Aruch, technically, the brother can marry the sister. Why? They share the same father. How can this boy marry this girl? What's that? Because she's not Jewish, and if she converts, they're not related. They're not related at all. They're not related. Exactly. Another example, a Tamar case. Exactly. And it's just trying to explain in the case of Tamar, how it was that David HaMelech, the great tzaddik, how did he live with this woman? She was Eshes Sifas Torah. The Gemara says that's what the assumption was. That's how he was allowed to live with it. Fine. So now the Ramah says something, and this will pique your interest. Hagah. Whenever you see Hagah in the Shulchan Aruch, that's a gloss from Rav Moshe Isserles on Rav Yosef Karo. Venerally, I think, the lechatchila aser lavo allow. Lechatchila, this boy should not marry his quote-unquote sister. V'yesh mistapkin lomar, and there are those who are in doubt to say, dedafka mi deoraisa, only from the Torah, havlad holech achar shivcha v'achar obedes kochavim, we follow matrilineal descent. Avol mi derabanan, but from a rabbinic perspective, have a zaro. It is the son of that father. L'chein, therefore, yesh lahachmir lechatchila. You should be machmir and not marry that one. Oh, so wait a second. So says Rav Goren, you might know this Ramah, right? What about this Ramah? No. What are you going to say? What are you going to say? They're going to say two things. The first thing is that all the Achronim here, they disagree with this Ramah. If you look on the side, the Chelkas Machokek and others, they say, I don't know what suffix it is. He says, no one in their life ever heard of this idea. So I have here, I put on the Marmakomos, number 15, the Bir Hagra, the Gaon of Vilna. He says, Svuki Eindio Deamahi. I don't know what kind of doubt this is. It's a Beferish Mishnah that we said that there's nothing. V'chein Kasav Shmuel. Everybody agrees. There's nothing to talk about. Now there is a Likut. The Likut of the Gra is where they collected his notes, and he quotes that there is a Yalkut. There is a Medrash. And the Medrash has a Pirush on it called the Zayas Ranon. Zayas Ranon, in the third line here, that's Zayin Reish. He's referencing the Zayas Ranon, and he says that's the source of the Ramah. The Zayas Ranon's Hesber for the Yalkut Shimoni. He says, but I'm telling you, if you look in the shot in that Yalkut Shimoni, the Zayas Ranon is wrong. There's no source for this either. So the Vilna Gaon says, I'll tell you what the source is. It's the Zayas Ranon's comment on the Yalkut Shimoni, and it's wrong. But Rav Goren says one step further. Forgetting the fact that all the Achronim disagree with this Ramah. Did the Ramah say that this is a two-way street of patrilineal descent? In Halacha, we have a Chumrah sometimes in a direction and a Kula in a different direction. Sometimes one person's status could be a Chumrah for one person and a Kula for another person. Two opinions, sometimes. But sometimes we are just adding a Chumrah in a one direction, in one way. The Ramah said, Min Torah, this child of a non-Jewish mother is not Jewish, period, end of story, sof pasuk. The Ramah says, oh, that status would have a lot of stringencies, because they're not Jewish, but it would have also a potential leniency. All the Ramah is saying is, we're not going to give you the leniency. Could become a ger if he wanted to.
Right. Only patrilineal conversion is not going to do. So it's really supporting it anyway. The side case is
Oh, so the only thing is that I think what the Ramah would be saying here is that midrabanan, we have to worry that he didn't even need to convert, and that he would be considered Jewish because of patrilineal descent. So what Rav Goren says is, he says, read the Ramah carefully. The Ramah is not saying that we would ever consider somebody whose mother was not Jewish. We would never, ever consider them Jewish. Never. It's just that if their father was Jewish, we would add a chumrah on the side of giving them a Jewish status. But we would never think that that person was actually Jewish. So,
but in that case, the child is still not Jewish.
Correct.
The father was a Jew and the mother's not Jewish. The father
is not Jewish. And all you would add is a chumrah that if that person would convert, that woman would not be able to marry the man who was her brother. Or if he was a man, he would not be allowed to marry his sister. That's all it's adding. So Rav Goren is saying, look, we have to be intellectually honest. You have to scan all the makoros. You have to look through all of the sources and figure out, ma yesh. Is there a strange shita out there? And that's where, coming back to some of the more interesting things in Rav Goren's life, in the case of the Langer controversy, he was trying to find some source, some way to, within the confines of halacha, even in his innovative application. But it's interesting how with Ben Gurion, you see, this is a traditional systematic approach to a halachic question. Rav Goren says, I have a halachic question. I need to look at the Gemara. I need to look at the Mishnayos. I find the precedents in Tanakh to support it, to fill out the picture. I look in the Shulchan Aruch. It says what it says beferish. I'm going to look in the Achronim, and that's how we're going to lead our lives. I'm going to end with one Maisa, just because it's such a fantastic Maisa, and it speaks to just the colorful nature of Rav Goren's life. Rav Goren single-handedly, literally single-handedly, liberated Chevron and the Ma'aras HaMachpelah. It's a Maisa Shahya Kachaya. Exactly what it was. So many of us are familiar with the iconic picture of Rav Goren standing at the kotel, blowing the shofar. Remember, he was a general in the army, so he had a military access. He had a jeep and a driver. So he's running around with a Torah, he's blowing the shofar, he's all over the place. He heard, because of his military connections, he heard that they were going to go the next day to Kever Rachel and to Chevron. So he told his driver shortly thereafter to be awakened in the morning, early in the morning, and to take him to Chevron, because he heard that the IDF was going to go to Chevron. So he gets up early. He tells the driver, we got to go to Chevron. So he goes to Chevron, but meanwhile, he did not know that Chevron had not yet been conquered by the IDF. He pulls up in his Jeep in the morning, and all he sees in Chevron hanging from the streets are white sheets. Surrender. Now remember, where did Rav Goren learn in the 1920s? He learned in the Chevron Yeshiva. What happened in 1929? There was a massacre in Chevron. This was not lost on everyone. So it's quite possible that the Arab residents of Chevron, they knew that Jews have a long memory, and they were concerned that when the IDF rolls into Chevron, you know exactly what's going to happen. So before the IDF gets there, Rav Goren shows up with all they see, with the surrendering Arabs. He drives to the Ma'aras HaMachpelah, where Jews have been denied entry for hundreds of years, and he blows the shofar. The problem is the Ma'ar is locked. So what does he do? He takes his Uzi, he has a submachine gun, and he blows the door, the lock off the door, and he comes in. And it's from that moment that Jews have the opportunity, the ability, and the schus to daven in Ma'aras HaMachpelah. Exactly as he had done the day before at the kotel with his shofar, he's blowing the shofar again. It's all because of Rav Goren. It's unbelievable. So this very unusual, colorful person made many, many contributions. But at the same time, what I wanted to share with you was how there was an element, there was a traditional halachic element, even with all of his innovation, that he wanted to share with Ben Gurion to explain to him